Ah, variations. Opus 109, Beethoven. Guidelines for interpretational choices. Tempi, phrasing, pulse, pedal, breathing, possible rubato, ornamentation, decoration. How do you fusion all these elements? First and foremost, for the tempo is the pulse rather than the beat. Of course, the meter is 3/4. The choice of the genre by Beethoven for the theme is the sarabande, where the second beat is heavier because of the Baroque dance choreography. Short, long, and the short being obviously not the upbeat of the long, which is how the classical music after the Baroque mostly treated upbeats. When Beethoven provocatively in the first concerto finale tries to give a sforzando in a comic effect, post-Haydn wit, but most of the time the upbeat is the lighter beat. And we settle on the downbeat, but in the sarabande is like in Bach, it's on the second beat that we have the weight. And therefore, if we want to find the right tempo for the third, first, second, and third beat of the 3/4, we can go faster and obtain a direct arrival point without the stretch of the tempo, so that we can define short-term arrival points, which is essential for any readable interpretation. The piano is able, with the pedal and the length of sound of its modern instrument, to extend so unnaturally for the genre of the sarabande. But for the aesthetic beauty on its own, sounds next to sounds, and it sounds very attractive, but in fact it doesn't have the underlining pulse, which gives it the meaning more than also the motion. So if you do play it for a practice to find the tempo, let's say like a moderato allegro, you realize that when you play it and you display it through the beats, it's not an accent that you give on the second beat, but in a lighter touch on the first, and then heavier touch on the second, and the escaped or passing tone on the end of the third beat, elegantly landing on the next first beat. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Evidently, Beethoven admired Bach's Goldberg theme, as well as its traction of short-long, compared to the first variation, which Beethoven will do. Of course, you have a waltz, long, short, compared to the. Here you have short establishes a very elegant landing and blossoming of the sound on the downbeat. How does also the right hand melodically deal with the 3/4 is very subtle, because you have the dotted quarter 3/8 notes encasing a 6/8 pulse of the division of the 6/8 notes of the 3/4 into 2 times 3, which is what Bach does in the first variation of his Goldberg ones. Left hand being in 6/8, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1. Doesn't have to be bowed like this with the, let's say, second half of the bar slur, but it's more demonstrative for the purpose. And right hand is 3 times 2/8 notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3. And left hand 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And similarly, when you have a 6/8 in the right hand, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the left hand 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1. Of course, in the first variation of Bach, it's relatively motoric, regardless how fast you will choose to play it. And this ping pong between 3/2 over 2 times 3, 3 times 2, it gives this playful impulse from one side and the other alternatively, and only meeting on the downbeat of the next bar. Of course, here it is slower. At the end of the first half into the dominant, he goes into 2 bars of 3/4, forming the 3/2 of the Hemiola, englobing 2 bars of 3/4. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. When the Hemiola is within the bar 3/4, subdividing the 3 times 2 to 2 times 3, it's a 6/8. But when you take 2 bars of 3/4 to create a bridge of a complete bar of 3/2, combining the 2 bars of 3/4, then you have a certain way of having larger step in order to go further in the conclusion without to slow down, even if theoretically the pulse of quarter notes and the pulse of half notes is by itself a ritenuto by pulse. And therefore you wonder why the interpretation would need on top of it a ritenuto, just to justify this intuitive, if not always awareness, but at least intuition that something is slowing down. It's rather the pace of the beats that is paced more than the tempo by itself that has to slow down to bring to a certain elegant arrival to the dominant before you restart. Here we touch to something very meaningful. How much do we need to think like this in terms of conductor who conducts and doesn't play? Therefore, the pulse is essential ingredient of their management of the performance. It's their own way of articulating, expressing, subdividing, or propulsing further a phrase, avoiding it from its heavy arrival point. If they want, they can accomplish something where everything is not melodic or harmonic, but in their gestures, generally, while it takes account of the melodies and harmonies, it's the propulsion. And so when you practice the piano and you play actively, if you count independently even the beats, then you have to play legato singing regardless of the beat. So you have to be your conductor that is, let's say, neutrally there, and the music subjectively, emotionally, melodically, harmonically, basically overwhelming you by the fact that you touch the music making by playing it, compared to a conductor who doesn't play but impulses others to play it. So you cannot hear the piece as a pulse, nor the piece as a melody with harmonizations only. But if you hear it vaguely combining all these by your inspiration, because it's beautiful, meaningful, driven, or in this case more dreamy, all this remains vague. And of course, in the rapport of the tempi between the variations, this takes an great importance to have an analytical, interpretational outlook on the evolution of the choices Beethoven does for the different aspects of the development of the variations, which is the genre that he chose, and that was so in vogue in his time. The transformational capacity of a given theme. Again, after the Baroque era, where it was really organizing this, the beginning of Age of Enlightenment, man shaping nature, therefore the form, the organization of elements, from the tuning to the organization of the repeats or restatements and the recapitulations and the symmetries. And then in this case, the variations is really a way to say, I can twist an idea in different aspects until you quasi don't recognize, while you're marveled of its different aspects revealed under different possible pulse, tempo choices. And it's true that when you have something like the third variation, which is in fact a double variation, because you have one where he atomizes the harmonization by making it in those dots, like pointillistic, if it was a painting by Seurat. And then the very lyrical overlapping of a dialogue within the same hand, of reproduction of the pattern of the descending third of the theme. On the dominant ostinato pedal, 6/4, dominant 7th, 6/4, dominant 9th, or rather just a melodic rise and drop based on the dominant without to be chordal each time. That's another point of view of point of views of vertical harmonizations on melodic patterns, even on stretched large beats. And there we touch again an ambiguity that is entertained by Beethoven. Already in 109, he purposely doesn't let us know when you hear it without reading it, if it's a downbeat or an upbeat that starts it. It happens to be up, but you don't know that. And in this case, the ambiguity is melodic. This accumulative imitation by step above in the same hand, but if you read it, you see the stems up and down. the crossing and the overlapping of the first voice. So if you take it as a 2-bar pattern, then you will have to bring out voicing in a way forcefully, so to say, to define for the listener who doesn't have the score, no GPS, no map, just hearing, so you're reading in the interpretation would be luminous for the listener who would be obliged to follow as if there were syllables of a sentence that takes 2 bars to be stated and not 1 bar, which ambiguously is very tempting. And because it's combined in the same hand, not on 2 steps of, let's say, an octave stretch, there it's more readable, but the ambiguity is to place it in the same hand, within the same octave. And then if you do it by 2 bars, then you have to voice where the first voice, where the mi, mi, re, it leads to this. And then you'll go above, and the second voice that enters 1 step above. So you could wonder, is this important? In a sense, do we play the impulsive, intuitive, I hear what comes on top of each other, and therefore this accumulative effect is emotionally the build-up of what he wants to do? By bar or by 2 bars? To a certain extent is the notation that gives us the clue. If he took or it perhaps was just, who knows, devil's advocate, perhaps it was just a notational device, not necessarily the notation translating the intent, or purposely leaving it to the performer to combine or to intertwine the 2 parts in the same hand, well, providing one can voice differently in the same hand, which is not a given, but a practiced element, which you have to do perhaps with practicing held and legato, with staccato. And until you hear them before you can play them. In fact, a lot of the interpretational choices I find with all my years of teaching are the capacity of the reader of the score, therefore the performer of the piano piece, capacity to hear all what is implemented in the notation. Not just because of recitation purposes and trusting this edition more than another. No, way philosophically more above is you only play what you heard. Just like the mother tongue, which was learned on the crib by ear, literally, and then later taught how to write it and read it. In some ways, you speak before you know what you say, but you do it phonetically as a baby. We all do in our native tongue. And therefore, this would be native, this would be read. Does it have to become a statement, a purpose, or just a vehicle? I think with time that it has to be meant. It has to be, if not discovered by the reader, then highlighted by the teacher. And let the student, maturing with time, filter it and decide how much of what to bring out. But it has to be a conviction that they have to forge themselves. But you have to reveal them if they haven't done so intuitively. And sometimes intuition doesn't go that far in complexities, because in a way satisfied beautifully by the sheer emotion. That emotion is a word, perhaps it's a bit easy, the sheer emarvelment in front of the elements. And it's true that when you play this second half of the second variation, and then you go back to Beethoven, where he strettos 2 bars in one, plus with trills on 8th notes. But professor, I don't have time to play all the notes unless I take more time, which then implements a rubato, and then it kills the pulse structure. But then if you do know that, how do you play fast trills? Perhaps on the action of the fortepianos of Beethoven, that was relatively less difficult because the depth of the decay of the depressing of the keys was not much less deep. And so I wonder if, to a certain extent, these trills are more like vibratos, shivers, rather than notational trills, which suggest the exchange of neighboring tones and a termination, which then makes it more heavy. Nor squeeze for the pulse, nor overstretch for the trills. It's perhaps another of those obligations to find pulse, melodic, and harmonic agreement to make little concessions. What is interesting is that in the first movement of 109, you open with this arpeggios with a melodic line suspended, with stems of quarter notes that most people, perhaps by shyness, to put it mildly, don't bring out. They prefer this gentle stretch of the triads being in first and second inversion, up and down, third to the fifth, fifth to the third, instead of Beethoven doesn't indicate a dynamic range for the quarter notes, so you could think, okay, it shouldn't be over surline, possibly. But after all, that's also something to bring to the awareness of the student, even if they perhaps saw it by reading it. And because the instrument of the piano plays mostly by moving parts because of the decay, the decaying held longer notes are more or less overridden by the arpeggiation. So, si, mi, sol, do, mi. But in the beginning of this variation too, atomizing in dots staccati the chords, which are arpeggiated in the first movement, he's exploring all kinds of the newly fortepiano for the day capacities of organizing resonances, overholdings, or just a lot of air between the notes, or arpeggiation, and all that before the pedal comes in to lift the dampers and make everything more resonant, but less focused on the specific notes. It's always useful like that to practice the harmonic progression in order to play best as written, reduce it to the continuous style harmonic keyboard harmony progression, and same thing for the theme. And then you play it as displayed by Beethoven. As something that always bothered me is, why is Beethoven not bothered by rising a seventh when normally in the dominant seventh you expect the tension release to close from the seventh and not. He does that so continuously in his especially late works, possibly feeling free from the boundaries of the voice leading four-part writing assignments that he must have more or less botched when Haydn was his teacher. I don't think Beethoven really cared much about it, because I think he was so more free in his head that he didn't feel like these are elements that should impeach him from doing what he wants in terms of the voicing. For instance, in the theme, when you reach the 5 of 5, he goes dominant 7, therefore that 7th should resolve to the D sharp, to the third of the dominant, in a unison, the leading tone being. But he goes up. The 7th should close, not open. But he uses it for the melodic bridge to the second half of the theme. As if he tells us, I assume, but perhaps I'm misreading his intent, is a bending of the rule of tension release of the expectation that you do when you do polyphonic movements of the voices is preferable in order to create a bridge. He could have very well, in order to avoid this, if it were to be bothering him, which obviously it wasn't, not do a dominant 7, but just a pattern that would involve a triad of the dominant. And if you want to really re-establish what he certainly didn't care about, rising the 7th, because he thought probably that the melodic voicing going up prevailed in that bridging to the rule that would have been applied, is to imagine it crossing. And well, of course, then in that case, you would have 2/5 by contrary motion. Not that, again, that would stop him either. So it's not a point to even probably silly try to save what he didn't do, right? But Bach does that in the Es ist genug chorale. Apparently, for 4 parts, he sounds like 3 parallel fifths, when in fact he crosses the tenor over the alto. But Bach, in voice leading, it's like Mozart, heaven on earth. Everything fits its place naturally. Beethoven is more a fighter. He doesn't, in a way, the beauty of his expression is the means are more important to arrive to the point than the details on the way for the layering. For instance, he does the same thing at the end of 101. Again, the 7th, melodically, instead of dropping to be resolved, rises. And you could see in the manuscript that he originally had 5 of 5, 2 dominant 7s in a row. Then he wanted to add, with a thicker ink, the suspension of the C sharp. But then it was too large for one hand. Therefore, he passed then the A natural in the left hand to distribute better the 2 hands. But then he arrived with the dominant 7th in the tenor, so to say, of the 4 parts. And instead of resolving it as he should have, he goes up. So in other words, he bends these rules of voice leading in order to create what he probably thinks rightfully one of the variations by element of reproduction of the pattern of the theme, which is the form which he'll develop in the different themes, variations of the theme I meant. I think it's very important to take these details in account and then blend them in the merging the traffic elements, acoustics, pedal, how much, where, after the beat, in order to avoid catching the residue of the preceding. That helps too. Clarity of the statement and faithfulness to the way he wrote it, as my teacher would say. If you didn't like the way he wrote it, then don't play him. But if you do play him like he wrote it, if not, write your own. Don't rewrite his, obviously. And I like to think that this kind of taking of account of the melodic, harmonic, pulse ideas as I develop here, some of them are useful food for thought guidelines for the choices of the interpretational elements between tempo, phrasing, articulation, pedal, how much the harmony overrides the melody, how much the melody defines the harmony, which are his choices. In the next variation, the most important choice is drastically getting rid of the 3/4 and having Why didn't he do it in 3/4? That's typical of my thinking outside of the box in order to serve the box. I think that stretto, literally tighter in Italian, narrower, is absolutely fantastic, because it gives all of a sudden, after the first two variations that indulge in 3/4, a very spread of the sarabande, all of a sudden, even if you don't play that fast, in which case it's 2/4, 2/4, 2/4, or 4 bars of 2/4 bar a beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And all of a sudden, going from those slow 3/4s to this driven forward 2/4, the theme is transformed drastically. And of course, immediately after that, you have this most complex, overlayered complexities of 9/8 coming after the 2/4, which broke the expectation of the continuity of the 3/4. And he writes, etwas langsamer als Thema, a little, somewhat, doesn't say little actually, really, somewhat etwas, slower than the theme after you went like so faster. So you have to remember the 3/4 and then go to the 6/8, 9/8, forgive me, slower than the 3/4. So the 9/8 is complex and subtle and more than that, it's unbelievably overlayering many ways of superposing pulse and phrasing and melodic line. For instance, the 16th notes by 4 and 6, obviously, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It was a Freudian slip, I said by 4, because 1, 2, and then 3, 1. No, he could have done the 3 times 2. In the design of the 16th notes, instead of 2 times 3. So the inner hemiola in the group of the decoration, and then all that within the 9/8. 1, 2, 3, and it's descending droppings and imitated, and then decorative patterns of hemiolic 16th notes of cascades, but ultimately dropping by descending 6 or 7 according to the theme. Of course, that's the form that he's developing, from which he adds on top of it a melodic line. Similarly to the two voices of the melodic line, overlapping and adding on top step by step. It's exactly what he does here, but on top of the 16th notes in the two hands. So it's like two sets of elements. It's a really string quartet writing with independent layers of melodic droppings, risings of melodic 8th notes without the dropping of the 16th notes, and then in the middle of that you have to follow a guideline, which is, in my opinion, the 8th notes, because the piano is a decaying instrument, and so in order to hear the 16th note, they will always pass because they're busy. They'll always be heard in the foreground, but if you don't bring out more intensely the long values, then they will blend in the 16th note, and you'll hear devil's advocate here. Obviously you wouldn't play it so blunt, but nevertheless, if you want to bring out the melody, you have to play those 16th notes more soft, and the 8th notes. It's an exponential expansion at the same time as the droppings. You have to follow each of the design of these patterns of decoration until they're dropping 6th. Or 7th. It seems like a blooming garden. Wow. Another of my strangely cheap analogies. When the complexity of the texture is so big, why reduce it just to that? Yeah. Voicing out controversies between how you think and you guide yourself to think and how you hear, and sometimes that doesn't go together in the same direction. But I think between this inner dialogue between yourself trying to figure out, what do I bring out? How do I bring it out? Pulse, phrasing, melodic line, decorative 16th notes. And if I put too much pedal, I harmonize. But then I have passing tones. And a modern piano being richer in tone, and the cross strings resonating more by sympathy. And you could say I will do it only with finger pedal. Being very stretched and unpractical, it also becomes very dry. So if you put some pedal after the beats or in between the beats, it's almost like puffs of a resonance to bridge the gaps of the stretches. Isn't it fantastic that this greater, considered rightfully, sonata for piano and pianoforte, specifically fortepiano in the day, is really nothing but a string quartet in its texture, in its conception, in its unadulterated writing by Beethoven, as if he says, go figure out how you play it with your 10 fingers, but I want all these layers. Well, then comes the fugato. Back to the 2/4, but in this case, as cut time, and it's interesting to observe that between this and this, compared to the 3/4, or even the or it seems clearly that for him the 3/4 is the elegance, and the 2/4 is the drive, pure energy, going to the point. The 2/4 is sort of the action, and the 3/4 is more the reflection or the emotion or the contemplation of the theme, and therefore using the descending thirds of the melodic line that is so characteristic to his theme. The contra-subject, if it were, is come in inversion and offbeat. So if you bring them out on the piano, you hear the first beat of the down right hand beat, and then off beat, second beat, accent of the left hand. That feisty element of contradiction, it's almost like two dogs biting the same bone, another of my cheap analogies. I find that the character and the tempi in these cases of these two binary pulse variations could be exaggerated in its tempo because it gives even more contrast with the 3/4 or the 9/8, regardless how many hemiolas combine the 3/2s of the two bars of 3/4, but it remains 3. And here is clearly binary in 2. So is it 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, which is obviously too fast for the one, not fast enough for the other, and they cannot all fit in the same shoebox because of the ideology of the pulse being binary. But it's still possible also to stretch it in terms of pulse tempo, but still think, of course, in group of bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Just like you can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you never want, when you practice, even if you're on the details, by the 16th notes articulate and practice, still be able to see the hypermeter, the group of phrase. If you don't think like this while you do the detail, the pattern of 2, 3, 4, 1, 16th notes like a la Bach, and that gives that perpetual motion, just like Bach. Everywhere he does. And so Bach inspired him motorically as well as thematically with the analogy of the very genre of the theme, evoking the pulse or the choreography, musically speaking, of the sarabande as a slow, stately dance after originally it was a very rowdy South American dance. But that's another story. And then it goes to another variation, which in fact is much more difficult to understand, because he ran out of his desire to develop the theme in different aspects. He decided to go through one of his late life special pulse rhythmic accelerando ideas, which he'll do also in 111 for the Arietta, which is to start with his quarter, 8th note, 16th notes by 4, by 6 in triplets, by 8 in 30 seconds, and then unmeasured fast in trills. And so again, the stretto ending of this variation that brings us suddenly back to the 3/4 restatement of the theme by the quarter notes, which will become by the 8th notes, by double, and then by triplets, and then by 16th notes, and then by 30 seconds, and then by the trill. Trill is always a problem because it's unmeasured by essence, but it's measurable by the performers. Either by the stretch it demands from the hands to, in fact, alternate when you cannot play them as notated. And it's not a question only of stretch of hand, of course it's a factor, but it is about the idea that he wants mechanically to build up, so to say, I call it rhythmic mechanical accelerando, and it implies a rhythmic accelerando itself, to which extent with the interpretation add the leaning to the hint of the pulse multiplying the group of notes to get shorter, faster, and more, and this idea of peopling the element until the unmeasured. And how do you play very fast a trill without to measure it, willingly measuring or unable to not to? But let's say you try, you have to replay the keys halfway up the key, because if not, you don't have the time fully down, fully up. It slows you down. So you have to do this kind of shake of repeating the notes, like if not, you hear, even with pedal. The pedal becomes a very nice way to cover the tracks and blur the effects. But it is very difficult to play unmeasured when everything is measured till the trill. So is it a metaphor for a free accelerando, in which case you don't have to because the reading of it clearly indicates that, and you see how compartmented the beats are with the multiplication of the shorter values within which people it. And this kind of variation, I think, becomes, of course, in his opinion, rightfully so, the climax of the variations, especially with the double trill. For me, it's more like a beehive. He superimposes the trill on the dominant pedal harmonically with diminished sevenths and sixths, or 5/5 or 2/5. But 30 seconds with dots on each first, just like in 110 when he goes. He does dot in 3 more 30 seconds of the first to the fourth together. Is it, in his opinion, a pulse, an accent in this fast tempo? How do you make it, the difference of it in here? It's kind of spikes, but within the motoricity of the arpeggiation of the chord, and overwhelmed by the low resonance harmonics overtaking different spectrum by this left hand overwhelming trill, which is the rhythmic peak of the whole group of variations that ends with the statement without repeats, just like Bach does for the Goldberg. So you could say, okay, he wants to finish anticlimactic. And he does. Because after this, the cheesy ending. God, I'm glad he didn't do that, right? Of course we know that. My silliness in demonstration reaches sometimes big lows. But the fact is that we play as it's written because inevitably it was written before we started reading it. So the conception of the piece happened in his brain, soul, heart, pianism, imagination, beyond the instrument, beyond his deafness, string quartet texture or pianism, fortepianism, pianofortism of the day. For him, exploring different elements of the textures, of combinations, the pedal included. Do we over-enhance it on the modern piano compared to what was expected then? Do we betray it by making it larger, longer in the resonance and louder? Do we have to imitate the thinness of the tone of the harp piano of the time? Are we to just adapt it to our own instrument, perhaps to our own hearing, our own awareness of the layered voice leadings compared to the vertical crunches of harmonic progressions that result from this inevitably more percussive than melodically displaying instrument, perhaps in denial. But I think that for a pianist today to approach these variations, these guidelines of pulse, melodic, harmonic progressions, details of patterns, richness of the variety of different looks at the same theme in a minimalistic way, just by little increments, and then finding a way to intertwine them all into one thread. Is not just playing one after the other, is also finding how to make the merger from one to the other, the transformation. Because after the theme, you have the first theme, variation, and then you have, with that inside it, then immediately followed by, and then and you could think, do I slow down when it's slower? Do I rush when it's faster? Do I bring it? Do I announce it, or do I do it subito? Well, he gives answers in the score itself, clearly. Are they rigid? Are they just notational? Are we to sort of ease into one or prepare for the next variation, announce it or surprise with it? It's up to the interpreter. I think that it's not 100% clear answer, one way or the other. I think it's what gives the charm of the sort of personal signature of an interpretation is, yes, you studied, you learned, you discovered, you experienced, you read people's thoughts about it, and at some point you just play. And it's in your playing that you're readable in your interpretation, what kinds of voicings you suggest, more or less subtly, how can you more bring the pulse element of development between the 3/4, 2/4, 9/8, cut time 2/4, return to the 3/4 with all this very bursting, quick 30 seconds into trills. Micro, macro, think the development through and think the variations as transformational elements that bring you from the beginning to the end of the theme and variations, not as separate elements, but ways to find in your performance how to make them become one piece with a flow, follow-up of the elements and merging into the next traffic section according to the different flow of pulse between the 3, 4, 9, 8 and so forth. All this is easy to say, difficult to do. It's important to think. And ultimately, when you play, to always remain at some point with a part of the brain open to the marvelment of, oh, how beautiful it is, how awkward it is, how unplayable it is, or how difficultly playable it is, but how meaningful it is to be able to spend a life trying to play it according to all this expectation from the notation and what it means to you compared to what it meant to your predecessors before it means to your successors, who will reopen the same score and go, what am I supposed to bring out? How am I supposed to find the right tempo? And what is the rapport between this and this variation? How do I make the transitions? Food for thought, as usual in teaching. And the results of these ideas harvested in students' futures interpretation, teachings in turn, recordings and so forth, and discovering in fact that the music is not only what it means to me or to you or to them or to him or to her, or it meant in the past differently in the future, perhaps because of the instrument, the recording techniques of today compared to before. Everything contributes to a different realization of the elements that are embedded in his thoughts processes that are notated and which we bring to life with our individual, ultimately, convictions from this communal score that is one for all, and it becomes your interpretation. And then if you're convinced, you're convincing. If you're inspired, you inspire. Is it the wrong way according to some, and is it the right way according to others? It's a scholars' battles, which is interesting, but necessarily not for the audience. For the audience, you're a storyteller. You bring it alive, and you make it as meaningful, as beautiful, as gracious as you think the tone quality of your playing, the legato quality of your playing, the pedaling enhancement of your playing could become this universal answer to this individual approach. Thank you.